Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started, if that's okay. Sorry to interrupt. My name is Helen. I'm a professor of French and European Studies here, so I'm keeping busy. And I direct the institute that Tim and I both work in, the Institute for Diplomacy and International Governance. We're shortly about to be the Institute for Diplomacy and International Affairs, so that seems a bit more inclusive. And thank you, Tim, for inviting me to chair this afternoon's session. Welcome, everyone. I won't take up too much time then. Academics always say that, but I really do try and I will stick to it. So the title of this session is How does the world view England? And Tim, you set out some questions, haven't you, that I know that our speakers are going to address. And I'll just say very briefly who you're going to be hearing from. And we're going to go in the order that's on your sheet, just to keep things simple. You can see it's a hybrid session as well. So I'm very happy to welcome the following speakers. So Helene, can I say it in French?
Yes.
Helene von Bismarck. So you are a historian.
Yes.
And a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. And you're based in Hamburg, but you're also a senior associate fellow of RUSI, the Royal United Service Institute, which obviously is a highly prestigious think tank and purveyor of ideas. So it's fantastic that you're here. Thank you. Next to you is Paul Gillespie, and Paul, I understand you're a journalist amongst us, a leader writer for the Irish Times, and you're also a senior research fellow, is that right, associated in the School of Politics and International Relations at University College Dublin. Thank you. Then Tim. So Tim, you joined IDIG in 2019, 18, yes, I think, so we worked together for a while. And you're something of a pioneer, so you wrote some of the first articles on Brexit before it even happened. And again, you're out ahead, I think, sort of getting us to talk about England. We don't really like to talk about England in England. And so I'm very much looking forward to the outcome of the interviews that you've conducted. And then online, we have, please, I apologise for any mispronunciation, Srdjan Vucetic, and you are Professor of Politics and International Affairs from the Faculty of Social Science at the University of Ottawa in Canada. So thank you very much for joining us. Hopefully you heard all that. Yes, thank you.
Yes, hi.
Thank you. And finally, also joining from online, but from a completely different time zone in Australia, is Ben Wellings. Should we say Ben? Yeah, you're waving. And Ben is Associate Professor also of Politics and International Relations, joining us, as I said, from Monash University in Australia. And I haven't seen the titles of your talk, so I'm very much looking forward to learning with yourselves the precise sort of focus of your talk. And I think, should we start with you, Helen? Helene? And perhaps when you get to 10 minutes, I'll put up a totally indiscreet 5 sign, which means there's 5 minutes to go. Okay, thank you.
Well, thanks again for the invitation, Tim. Well, how does the world view England? I'm obviously not the world, but I'm first about what I'm going to say and what it's based on, because we have had this really impressive panel with all this very analytical polling as sources. And what I'm about to tell you is different in the sense that this isn't how I view the UK, because I'm not a stereotypical German in the sense that I'm a historian of Britain and the British Empire and have spent the last 20 years studying this country, so I'm obviously not representative of Germans per se. But also this is not based on polling of German public opinion. It is more a result of my moving around very much between London or Britain or generally and Germany. I do a lot of sort of bilateral things, with, I meet a few politicians, a few officials, I meet lots of think tankers, journalists, civil society, everybody who has some kind of interest in the relationship between our countries. And I also meet sort of more generally, I'm also interested in UK-EU relations, but what I'm about to say is predominantly based on Germany. When it's more wide on sort of European, I'm going to point that out in the moment. But so this is sort of my impression of how people who are involved in the relationship between our countries or in the relationship between the EU and the United Kingdom see this country. I think I'll start with the German language. Nobody in German would ever say, ich fahre ins Vereinigte Königreich. Absolutely nobody. It doesn't exist. It would be the literal translation of I'm going to the United Kingdom. Everybody would say I'm going to England. Some people might say ich fahre nach Großbritannien, but this is already a highly educated person trying to be specific. You know, it's not sort of common use. And for a very long time, I think it would, I mean, for probably centuries, people equated England with Britain and wouldn't really make the effort of distinguishing between Scotland, let alone Wales. It's different with Northern Ireland. I think that if somebody went to Northern Ireland, they would always say that, ich fahre nach Nordirland. But nobody would say, ich fahre nach Großbritannien and mean Nordirland, and nobody would ever use the phrase, ich fahre ins Vereinigte Königreich. So that has always been specific, Northern Ireland. But, so England was very dominant in the perception, and I think this changed slowly sort of since the 1980s, and there is an organization in Germany called the Deutsch-Britische Gesellschaft, which means British-German Association, which is not to be confused with the same organization which exists in this country, but they're totally separate. But this used to be called the Deutsch-Englische Gesellschaft. And the name was changed in the 70s for a very simple reason. There was a Scot who was also a British government official who came to their events and said, unless you rename yourself, I'm no longer coming. Just as an anecdote to show how this changes. And as I already said, so I think over the years, there's now people would automatically say, ich fahre nach Schottland. So people would no longer, which they might have done in the 50s accidentally, you know, just confuse the two. I'm not sure they would be as sensitive about Wales, honestly. And I also think when it comes to, you know, how people see this country, and by this country I mean the entire United Kingdom, I think that Scotland is perceived as a really very important, actually iconic in lots of ways, part of Britain. And it's very hard for Germans to imagine them apart. Or at least that was the case until quite recently. Because when we think about, you know, Britain has a very strong sort of cultural brand in the sense that, you know, you think, and this is, again, not a specialist, this is a normal person thinks about Britain and they would think about the monarchy, they would think about the island, and they would think about the empire. And I think they would also think about sort of bagpipes and tartan skills. So it's part of the iconography, which is very influential, and I think people here don't really realize just how influential it is. And so to this admittedly very oversimplified view of the UK or Britain, I think a big shock in recent years was the Scottish independence referendum, because there was genuine surprise how close the result was. And I think that, I mean, rules and exceptions apply, but in the sort of German foreign policy making scene, as well as sort of civil society interested in Great Britain, there was, unless some people had a specifically Scottish connection, most people were very relieved that Scotland didn't become independent. Simply because it would have been a huge constitutional upheaval, or that's what it seemed like, and people, you know, especially when it's not your problem, you prefer stability to upheaval. I think that's quite natural. And then there was another transformative moment for sort of international perceptions of the United Kingdom, and that was Brexit. And that is actually there's a bit of a paradox in the sense that Brexit, for a time, dramatically increased interest in the United Kingdom, and then that interest fell off a cliff to much lower than what it was before the referendum. So the referendum happened, and I think this is true of the entire European Union. There was genuine shock, and nobody, and that's honestly, it's our own fault. Nobody believed that this could happen precisely because it seemed such a huge thing. You know, it seemed too big to happen or something. And then there was a lot of, there were the negotiations, which were of course difficult and you know, sometimes unpleasant, but also there was this constitutional upheaval here, political crisis for years, and just this constant drama. And then everybody suddenly started watching Parliament TV in their free time, and it was sometimes very amusing. And this also has something to do with your language. I think English is, in many ways, sort of your biggest soft power asset. It is also your downfall, in the sense that everybody is listening to what you say to each other, and you don't really realize this. Sorry. But I mean, my prime example was during the Brexit negotiations, when the possibility that there might be a no deal was very much discussed. I remember a speech by Penny Mordaunt in the House of Commons when she said, we need to accept no deal as sort of a negotiating tool. We need to put it on the table to pressure the EU to give us a better deal. And I just said, you just said that on camera in Parliament, and they have internet in Brussels, and we all speak English. So apart from the fact that this would not work, you've just showed us your whole strategy, that you don't really want no deal, you just want to pressure people with it, so then perhaps not say that. Anyway, and that was just an example to me about, you know, how the chasm between how people see themselves and are seen is big. I think I should at this point, it's really important to me to say, this sort of difference between the way one sees oneself and is seen is not exclusively different. God knows the Germans have that too, particularly recently in the last 2 years. And the French have it very much. I think this has also, Julie has left, but she spoke about, you know, the small countries and the countries that do not know that they're small. I think very often the discussion about the differences between the British and the Europeans is based on differences between three countries which are comparable in lots of ways in terms of size, population, economic might, and so on, which Britain, France, Germany. So very different from the perspective of a small country like Denmark or a more southern country. So it's sometimes oversimplified on all sides. And so I'm just saying, because I probably sound critical when I say you don't know how people see you, the Germans also don't know how people see us. So I'm not saying this is just here. So there was dramatically increased interest in the UK, and with that came more interest in the differences between the component parts of the United Kingdom, particularly Scotland and Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland, obviously, because it was a huge Brexit problem, what to do with the Irish border. And Scotland, because it has to be said that the Scottish nationalism has had a really good Brexit, because the SNP then very much positioned themselves as very strongly pro-European, and Scotland didn't vote for Brexit, and you know, there was lots of unhappiness about the vote. And what was really interesting to me is how people who 2 years earlier were very relieved that the Scottish didn't become independent suddenly very quickly became much more sympathetic to the cause of Scottish nationalism. And that's what I mean with they had a good Brexit, and that's also something Julie mentioned. I mean, the Scottish government is basically running its own diplomacy now. They have offices abroad, and they try to interact with national governments such as the German and Icelandic. So that is quite interesting how they do this. And what I think people don't appreciate, who don't study this full time, is how, so on the one hand there's more interest and more knowledge about the differences between the component part, but often this is also quite superficial. Because you can accept that Scotland overwhelmingly voted against Brexit, and you can also accept that the SNP is very sort of pro-European, but on the other hand, at the time of the Brexit referendum, 30% of the voters, of the SNP voters, voted leave, and nobody talks about this. Nobody picks up on this in Europe. So that's why, and I think there were sometimes also oversimplified views of the situation in Northern Ireland, in the sense that there was real, and that was genuine, there was great concern that there could be violence again on the island of Ireland, and that the peace was fragile, and that this was risking it. So this wasn't, as some sort of British media outlets suggested, it wasn't some kind of ploy. People were genuinely very worried, and the fact was just that Ireland was still in the EU, so the vote put the UK and the EU on opposite sides of the negotiating table, and Ireland was on our side and Britain was not, which personally sort of broke my heart, but yeah. But it meant that this was probably a disadvantage for Northern Ireland Irish unionists. But I also think that knowledge of sort of the deep historic roots of unionism is limited in Germany. One last point on Northern Ireland, I also think that there was great consternation that a party that calls itself conservative and unionist would pursue the policies that it did. So lots of interest, sort of better knowledge of the differences within the UK, but also some superficial or sort of limits to that increased knowledge. And then, as I said, this fell off a cliff. Once Brexit was concluded, nobody, Britain wasn't very interesting anymore to anybody. And this also has an institutional dimension because there are just so many rooms, and I don't just mean politicians, but intellectual things which happen on a European level, and there are no longer British people represented. And so I think there's also sometimes skewed view here, because then you have a politician who said, oh, this hasn't changed anything, when wherever I go everybody wants to talk to me. But that person isn't even aware of all the rooms she isn't in. And that gives her possibly a skewed perspective. I think, looking in the future, I think that more people than before Brexit expect the United Kingdom to break up eventually. I sometimes am a bit critical of this personally, because I think it's also, again, a bit simplified. But I should say that just because lots of people expect this doesn't mean that they wish for it. I think at the end of the day, it would mean that there would be a huge other upheaval in our neighbouring country, which continues to be a close ally. So I don't think people want this, but they are worried that it'll happen, and they are sympathetic to this sort of pro-European Scottish point of view. Looking into the future, ultimately the differences between the four component parts is regarded as an internal UK problem, with the possible exception of Northern Ireland. I'll just give you a quote from one German journalist who covers the United Kingdom, who says Scottish independence is Brexit for left-wing people. I'll just leave it there. I'm not saying that I agree, but that's his view. And I think what can influence future perceptions depends very much on what's going to happen to the relationship, because obviously knowledge depends on seeing each other, talking to each other. So I think one thing is really key is mobility, and the question of, especially for the young, in the long run. And British schools and universities and language schools, etc., have played such a key role in getting Europeans, and I think there I can speak for the continent, interested in this country and knowledgeable about this country, and this has all fallen off the cliff because of the hard Brexit. And then also the question of what relationship a future British government might have with the EU as a whole, as well as with individual member states, because I think that especially in Western Europe, a bilateral approach isn't wrong, but it's not enough, because this is a question of trust. And as long as the British government sort of ignores that there is such a thing as the European Union, nobody in Berlin will trust them. That's what it comes down to, and I think this is where I'll end.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Perhaps without any delay, perhaps we could turn to you, Paul. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and lovely to be here, and congratulations for raising this subject. First of all, I go to Gallup, a bit of context. The intimacy of the Irish-British relationship should be properly understood around the European system as well as in England. Ireland is England's oldest colony. The expansion of England historically, I'm not going to go over the 800 years, but through the medieval period, through the Reformation, through the 17th, 18th century wars, the 19th century wars, there was always an international component to this. It was a security defence issue that was mentioned earlier, with France, with Henry II, all through the medieval period, not as intensively as, because it was a stable enough settlement for 2 or 3 centuries. With the Reformation, with Spain, with France looking forward, the 17th century wars with the French, The 18th century wars with the US, again with France, the French Revolution, and the 19th century with Germany, and empires competing empires. So you have an embeddedness of Ireland within Britain as a colony and being ruled and jointly run within that European setting. Independence for Ireland is an independence from empire. The Irish nationalism is an anti-imperial nationalism. That means it has built into it a certain kind of internationalism that's different from imperial nationalisms. This involved a new relationship, of course, with Europe, but a continuing dependence on Britain, economically and culturally and politically. And the joining of the EU in the 1970s, jointly with Britain, was a huge leap towards greater interdependence between Britain and Ireland within that European setting. Very big shift, and one that led to a kind of normalization of relations and a deeper friendships. There are four, I'd say, political forces at play in the macro history of this relationship. You have the political imperial power relationship. You have question of geographical scale. One big England far bigger than the others, and Britain much bigger than Ireland, but not always as large as it became. In 1800, the Irish population was 1/4 that of Britain. By 1900, it was 1/10. So that was to do with power relations. Economic wealth, of course, another factor, and cultural connectedness, and the intimacy of the relationship. We all have virtual common citizenship on a free travel area, but that goes along with very asymmetric knowledge. It's said that the Irish never forget and the British never remember, but the depths of ignorance that Irish people encounter when they encounter the relationship with English people and English elites leaves one gasping. The four questions: how do outsider observers and governments view the UK's future? Well, I'd speak from the observer point of view first. There's a good knowledge of the structure, national structure of Britain, of Scotland and Wales as well as England in Ireland, as you might expect, by unionists and nationalists alike. There are sensitivities, there are sympathies there. There are many Irish people in England, as you know. There's about 600,000 Irish-born people in Britain, as I understand, but about 6 million would have Irish roots. And you can have common identities and affiliations, of course, from that. You have on the research area that I'm involved in, I'm specialising in British-Irish relations within a European setting. I'm running a project called Constitutional Futures After Brexit, which is looking at potential constitutional futures. We're looking at scenarios of change. There's a much greater awareness, we find, amongst British researchers of the Irish factor in British history, including British imperial history, because of the growth of understanding of the imperial factor within British history itself. That's really important. We have think tankery and publics, and north and south. We have a very good knowledge, an intimate knowledge, if you like, of England. As to the views of governments, of England's influence, that is a matter of Anglo-Irish relations that used to be called traditionally. There was a certain revolt against that when we became more aware of the British dimension, Scotland, Wales. It's now called British-Irish. Sometimes I tend to look at it, Irish-British and British-Irish relations, two different things seen from different perspectives. But there is a great sympathy and understanding of that differentiation nationally within the UK amongst the Irish government. There are consulates in Scotland, Wales, now in Manchester also, an awareness of the regional identity in England. And there's, of course, the big consequential treaty-based agreement in 1998, the Belfast Agreement, which commits both governments to holding referendums should there be a desire for Irish unification and a specification of how that would happen. So that puts us again in a very distinctive place. Now, the views of England's influence on the UK and the UK's place in the world, there's a strong, much stronger, regarded as much stronger English, with Brexit, a much stronger English influence on the UK, a unitary, muscular unionism which comes over, very much Anglo-centric, not English nationalists. And this is a question, there are some Irish commentators, including Fintan O'Toole, who's written very influentially on this, who factors in a big role for English nationalism. I would go with some of your reservations on this. I don't think it's fully fledged. It's more Anglo-British than English in its mainstream manifestation. It is still the Conservative and Unionist Party, and the vis-a-vis or the othering of English nationalism is Brussels rather than Scotland, Wales, or indeed Ireland. But that may shift, and perhaps a nativist English nationalism may come into there as more of a factor. So a Labour government, it's understood, will try to make devolution work much more, including in Northern Ireland. There's going to be a factoring over of the Northern Ireland question to the Scottish one as this develops. There's going to be I would say, looking forward, a real difficulties for Labour in its second term, presumably it has one, because they don't have the wherewithal to hold a more transactional union together, and therefore the continuing support for independence in Scotland that's there is going to resurrect itself, it seems to me. This is scenarios. So you have scenarios that we've developed and others have developed on a radical reform of the union to hold it together, a federalisation perhaps, a muddling through which will only postpone things and make things worse, or a breakup. And we have to think about breakup and are thinking about breakup and the continuing relations that would have to happen between Ireland and any newly sovereigntised Britain. And there are debates about that, as you might imagine, in Ireland. But again, I'm underlining how well we know the case. The UK's place in the world, Scotland's independence would profoundly affect the UK's place in the world. And that's fully understood, whether it be the United Nations Security Council, the G7, the relationship with the US. It's understood in all sorts of research domains. And it's factored in as a potential, the breakup scenario, as prudentially, it's sort of as important as the unionist stronger or weakening case for keeping the union in Northern Ireland is the perhaps disintegration of the very centre of power within Britain. In some of the work I've done, I've talked about a loss of statecraft or in the management of the union and the management of UK foreign policy, increasing dysfunctionality of the UK state. It's like living beside a big elephant, and if it topples over, you have to be very careful and smart. And of course, the Irish government was really smart during the Brexit thing. Our research institutes and other government, we didn't quite foresee it coming. We knew very well that it might come. And by goodness, the preparation was done for that in Dublin and then in Brussels. So the remarkably rapid snapping into place of the structures to deal with Brexit in Brussels had a lot to do with an Irish input, diplomatic input. I mean, that happened nearly overnight with Juncker's decision-making, Barnier, Vaillant, these remarkable decisions, and the winning of the argument that membership matters, as you were saying, and the Northern Ireland issue is central. The staging of the negotiations, getting the Northern Ireland question handled in the first stage, was a crucial thing. And we were astonished, frankly, at the ignorance and ill-preparedness of the British dealing with the Irish, not only the Irish question, but then with the wider portfolios in the negotiation itself. And British-Irish relations, Irish-British relations, tumbled, I mean, in their quality and intensity over these months and years. And we're still recovering from that. And it's very much in the interest of the Irish government and Irish state, elites and policy elites, that the relations would be good. And it's very much in the interest as well that Britain and the UK would be as close as it can find possible to be with the EU. More converging than diverging, for example, selectively having to associate with the various structures, including the security one. That's fully understood. And there's an Irish process of learning, policy learning coming through this as well. But I would say a willingness also to engage with, let us say, a new Labour government to get bilateral relations up and running again, very good relations with Ben and Hilary Benn and others. That's all sort of catered for and being factored in, but also a great willingness to work with people like David Lammy in facilitating a reconvergence, if you like, of macro-British policy towards Europe, if that's what happens. And that, as I say, would be very much in the Irish, both state elite and popular interest, including with Sinn Féin, which is the radical opposition nationalist party, which may or may not lead the next Irish government. So you have this. I won't go into the Brexit details, but I'm saying the Brexit thing profoundly affected these relations. So the final question is: do any differences within the UK leave it vulnerable to outside interference and influence? Well, Irish politics play into British politics. We're doing a book as part of our project entitled Political Change Across Britain and Ireland, and we've 11 chapters, each jointly done by a British and an Irish author. And there's a very interesting mutual learning process on the political dynamics and interdynamics of the two islands' politics, notwithstanding the different sovereignties and devolutions at play. And that's something that's opening up. We are doing some thinking about a unionism beyond the union. Supposing the breakup happens, the need for functional and affinity and belonging links will still be there. And there's some good, interesting thinking going on in Scotland, Wales and Ireland about confederal relations with not just around the periphery, the so-called Celtic countries, but also with England proper. And we're watching very interestingly the debate on English political identities emerge, and the debates about inequalities within England and the debates about regional structures in England, particularly the mayoralties. And that's so. We're well informed, we like to think, and actually they genuinely are on this. And we're in a position also, and it's important that people in England and Britain would know this, to influence a Europe that's lost interest in the way that you've described as this reconvergence takes place. Thank you.
Thank you. The applause is for both papers. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Also for sticking to time. Excellent. So we're moving now to Tim. Do you have slides then, Tim?
Yeah,
okay. I'll be just as harsh with Tim on the time.
When I put together the bid for this project with John to the British Academy, the one thing that I wanted to do was go around Europe and ask elites. I didn't really want to talk to the publics because I didn't think the general public would probably understand some of the nuances. I wanted to understand how elites would try and understand England's place within the United Kingdom. And this stretches back actually to something that Helen talked about, which was my early work on Brexit back in 2013-14, when I was invited to speak on Brexit, or the potential for Brexit, in Brussels. And I delivered a talk about what a British exit could mean for the European Union. And in reply, my two respondents just talked about Scotland. All they could talk about. And in reply, I said, yes, there is a plausible scenario in which, yes, Brexit leads to the disintegration of the United Kingdom. But what about England? And I started to push them on England, saying, well, England is 85% of the UK. What country is then left outside the European Union? And in reply, my respondents talked again about Scotland. And I quickly realized they didn't know anything to have to say about England. They just knew a lot about Scotland, not very much about England. And these were two respondents who were from elsewhere in the European Union. They weren't, and they were both familiar with the UK. So as part of this project, I wanted to look at elite views and whether or not they've been changed by Brexit. So I've conducted 20 interviews. Well, I should say 19, and one keeps on being postponed, and the one that's been postponed repeatedly is with the Irish experts, you would say, with people who know the UK, have studied in the UK, lived in the UK, worked with the UK, studied the UK. They're mainly at think tanks, universities, or have been involved in some form of government role that gives them strong connections with the UK. Semi-structured in these interviews. I didn't code the transcripts. I'm just getting to the point where it's maybe a bit too many not to start coding, but I think 20 is just about right. And several themes emerged. I'm going to quote from some of them. First one is, of course, unsurprisingly, as Helene pointed out, that for most people elsewhere in Europe, when you say England, you mean Britain or UK, and Britain, UK often in their minds means England. Now, why or how does this come about? Well, the first thing is, yes, it's confusion, it's conflation. Just to take two interviewees, it's unintentional, it happens unconsciously, this isn't deliberate. Some of the interviewees were more than aware of the distinction and tried in their own minds, in their own working life with the UK, to try and always keep the distinction between England and the rest of the United Kingdom there in their minds. But even they admitted there are times when they slip into saying England when they meant the United Kingdom. Some people know, sort of in the back of their mind, that there's Scotland, that it's something different within the UK, but for public discussions, England, Great Britain are used as synonyms for the United Kingdom, which is probably the least used of the three. And I started it quite late on in the interviews, and I'd like to do a little survey of this. What is the most common phrase used around in different European countries? England, Great Britain, Gross-Britannia, or United Kingdom? As one person from France said, no one ever refers to the United Kingdom. Although the UK has started to creep into the French language now and again. So I might have to do a survey of this. I might have to have a little other, and people can input the one they want. Why does this come from? Well, partly it comes from confusion about the UK's constitutional setup, which is confusing, as anybody who studies the UK's constitution will know. If you ask me for one word to summarise the European understanding of the distinction between England, Great Britain and the UK, I think my one word reply will be confusion. It's a very peculiar system that you have, and I don't think anyone outside the circle of people who really know the UK would notice this. This idea of having a UK government, which is also an English government, doesn't make sense. An interviewee had before this been talking about the West Lothian question and trying to explain the West Lothian question to people elsewhere in Europe, and it just did not seem to compute to large numbers of people elsewhere. Say another German was trying to understand this in terms of the federal system, and it just did not work. So the confusion partly stems from the confusing state of the UK's own constitution. Where there are appreciation of differences, they can often be shallow. Again, one German that I spoke to here, I remember when I started writing texts about Brexit, how often I had to explain the difference between UK, Great Britain and England, even to elite audiences at the Bundestag. Because many in the German political elite read English language quality newspapers, as Helene points out, the Financial Times, the Economist, you would see them being familiar with terms like the red wall seats. But sometimes I wondered whether they actually understood what's behind this, because if you dug into that, they don't really understand the first past the post system. This was something repeated several times by people I interviewed when they spoke to elites, members of parliaments, officials and so forth. Yes, they were aware of the difference, but actually if you scratch the top of this, their understanding was very shallow. Some of the interviewees, however, were more than aware, and some less so, of potential bias. Now, many of these, as I said, had studied, lived in the United Kingdom. That gives us strength. They understand the UK to some extent. It also comes with a con in that they formed a part of, say, an elite community bubble in the UK. As one interviewee said, I think what's true is that plenty of, especially the bureaucrats sort of in the Brussels bubble, all these international people, many of them have spent a year at a university in Britain, and mostly this will have been at Oxford, Cambridge, London, or Edinburgh. It's a small little elite community that studied within an elite community within the United Kingdom. So Oxford, Cambridge, Edinburgh, LSE, especially LSE in Brussels. I did find more traction when I asked about interpersonal relationships and how people understood these three individuals. Do they see them as English or English nationalists, British nationalists, and so forth? Farage, usually people would say, yes, the Englishness comes through very clearly. Although even some people said, someone interviewed referred to him, yeah, he's an English nationalist, but in the same way that you mean English to mean British, that confusion again comes along. Johnson, to be kind to some of my interviews, they were quite forthright. These are not people who are, shall we say, Eurosceptics. They tend to be European elite across the rest of the European Union. So Johnson provokes quite strong reactions in terms of the English buffoon, but they're more than aware of that very privileged English background. What was more interesting was when I started asking a bit about the Prime Minister, about Rishi Sunak. There, some of the interviewees erred. He is the English Prime Minister, but we know that there's a bit of a racial issue in terms of Englishness, Britishness, and that started to come out with some of them. Kind of like, ooh, Yes, he's the English one, but I know why you're asking this question. I can sense that some people would be uneasy with calling him in English, even elsewhere in Europe, because of his racial background. Second big theme, the Brexit effect, as Helene and Paul have both pointed out. This was a real shock. It came as a shock to even these elites. England, or Britain, was seen as a very open, a welcoming nation with a language that's global, football and music, art, culture, all very much enjoyed and shared by everyone. So the perception of England or Britain was the exact opposite to what Brexit presented to them. It did therefore raise awareness of internal differences. I think the extent there's any even vague awareness outside the UK that the UK is comprised of different countries is, funnily enough, on the back of the Brexit vote. Okay, pretty obvious. Well, where does this go? Well, first of all, yes, Scotland stood out by a long way. This came from sympathy for Scotland and also the Scottish government's own initiatives in Brussels and elsewhere to raise the profile of Scotland. Beforehand, people wondered, why would you leave the UK? It's a modern democratic country. Very little understanding for Scotland in 2014. And that turns around with Brexit. We have, for instance, Nicola Sturgeon visited this was Germany, I think in 2015 or 16, before the EU referendum. There was not much willingness to engage with her. When she came again in 2021 or 22, she was basically celebrated as a political rock star. However,
Things changed again.
yes, this has declined somewhat. The UK is, and especially Great Britain, with the exception perhaps of Northern Ireland, the question there because of the Irish dimension to this, Great Britain is now treated very much as a third country, not third countries. Scottish, Welsh, perhaps less so Northern Ireland, have found it more difficult to gain, to be heard in Brussels, to be heard elsewhere in Europe, partly because Brexit has declined as an issue, and their position within the UK, well, they're treated now, if you ban, say, when the European Union said no to no negotiations with British officials, that includes Scottish officials as well. The devolved administrations are certainly visible, but the English regions are no longer so in the way that they were before Brexit. That's as it was. So there is a distinction here. Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland retain their offices in Brussels. The City of London still has some representation, but the English offices, they're gone. Those links have just been severed. And some people pointed out that Scotland's opposition to Brexit or certain Brexit positions within the Brexit negotiations didn't necessarily mean that people understood it was a separate region or a separate country or a separate entity. They viewed it as something like, well, it's another political voice opposing this. So Nicola Sturgeon in the UK was seen as a kind of opposition party to the mainstream government position, rather than the governing party of a devolved nation. So they were often seen as then this minority voice objecting to the mainstream view in Westminster, rather than pushing separate needs. It did reinforce stereotypes, as I think we've touched on already. Bizarrely, Brexit has on the one hand taught people a lot about the UK, about its internal politics and complexities and differences between England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, but it's also given rise to a pretty bit of stereotypical thinking. The English are the little Englanders with their imperialist arrogance. The Scottish and the Northern Irish are basically the victims of the English. Another interviewee based in Scandinavia talked about how often they had to explain, say, ethnic minority Leave voters. But the view there was a very, very kind of crude understanding of what had driven Brexit. Interest in UK politics has decreased post-Brexit. Now Brexit's being realised, I think we're going back in the other direction again. The people pay less and less attention to the differences. So they might theoretically know that there is a difference, but in practical terms, that doesn't really feature anymore. Does this mean British foreign policy equals English foreign policy? Well, not necessarily. Scotland is seen, and this is how I often try to find some understanding of nuances within the UK. If I started with Scotland rather than with England, people could talk about how Scotland is probably more social democratic. They understand it's more progressive. I think that certainly comes across. But outside of the EU question, I don't think there's been a particular foreign policy issue that I would consciously think people see a difference about. If you think a little bit deeper, it might be on Gaza and Israel, but that's so recent that I don't see that. I don't think there's a big difference. Other people have talked about, actually, the tensions are not between Scotland and with the English as such, as with UK government. There's a kind of acknowledgement that Scotland may not see eye to eye with the rest of the UK. It's not pitched in terms of England versus Scotland or the other nations versus England. It would be more London, and here they mean more the centre of government, rather than the idea of England. So this thing of UK versus other parts of the UK whether it's Scotland, different parts of England. This comes through when you ask about England and differences within England. First of all, they all talk about, we all know London's very different, potentially. But one thing several interviewees pointed out, it's quite interview before, on London, there is a very strong recognition that culturally London is different, but that does not translate into any kind of political recognition. Certainly when you compare it to other international cities, the significance of London as a separate political player is not really very developed. So London doesn't seem to have agency, even within England, as distinct as it is. The one body or the one thing that they think does have agency is UK government in London. I think it is very much depends on the London you want to look at and the sort of understanding you have of London as a city and as an actor in itself, or as where the foreign policy of the UK is designed and implemented. So interview 17, you're talking about actually it's UK government. It's not London or Londoners, or even the English, it's UK government. Others refer, especially in France, talking about, you see this in France, that the French foreign policy is run by French government in Paris. It doesn't represent necessarily Parisian or even certain French regional interests. It represents a French foreign policy. And then finally, views about a post-UK England. UK doesn't seem as unstable as some, especially to the Belgian interviewees, shall we say. So others were a bit more worried about their own unity compared to the UK. Some pointed out that the growing geo-economic competition may push and hold the UK together in future, that any dreams of kind of Anglo-Saxon free trading economics and so forth will slowly drift away as geo-economic competition heats up, and that makes the disintegration of the UK more difficult. And some even hinted Scotland was kind of ahead of the curve here in our understanding of Scotland being much more inward-looking, investing and so forth, compared to say, maybe English. Yes, there would be a degree of schadenfreude, but there would also be worry. There would be some sense of schadenfreude, but on the other hand, there will be some dread about losing and weakening an essential ally. Would the post-UK England therefore turn into a little England or some form of other country? Would it form itself? Well, most of the interviewees talked about maybe being a littler version of Britain. I think it would be a little Britain. Whether it would work is a different question. An interviewee 11 echoed this. I think in many respects it would be a smaller version of Britain. At least it would try to be so, because the elites more or less would be the same. But there would be a massive amount of soul searching and questions about English identity which would emerge as a consequence. Other interviewees talked about this as well. That yes, the post-UK England would continue to behave as a successor state, much the way it says to the UK, but all of them said over the longer term, that's when they'd expect more soul searching and something to actually hit quite deep. But in the short term, they wouldn't expect England to behave any better than the United Kingdom has.
Thank you.
Can you all hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Huge thanks to Tim and John for inviting me to another one of your great events. Wish I was there in person, of course, but certainly delighted to meet all of you virtually. So I entitled my talk, England According to the European Radical Right. It's based on some work in progress. Only Ben Wellings, who will be speaking after me, will recognize the topic. The rest of you are welcome to get in touch with me for this 4,000-word paper that very much needs a friendly intervention. So let me first start with the term radical right. Well, it is very much topical. The political parties of what I call the radical right are in the news because of the latest or this weekend's European parliamentary elections. The center held, but is it really still the center? The radical right parties, the European Conservative Reformers and Identity and Democracy did well, better than ever before. And one could argue that this means that the so-called center is shifting further and further right, just as it has been doing for over a number of years. So the question I ask is, how are these actors, I don't mean just political parties, constructing England, or how do they view England? And the data I include in this talk comes from a book, co-authored book that you can pre-order if you like, ahead of its publication in late July or early August. It's basically by a group of us at the University of Ottawa and Queen Mary, and we look at the broad range of radical right communication from a historically and sociologically informed perspective. We make some provocative arguments about global liberalism, Gramsci, and geopolitics. So part of my talk is based on those readings. Second part of the talk is based on a solid amount of literature on illiberalism, if you like. Here I have a chapter by Varga and Bozogani that emphasizes divisions, tensions, and mutual antagonisms within this political force. My talk today is, in fact, building on this quite a bit. So let me talk about England next. What do I mean by England? Elsa Henderson will be speaking at the second afternoon panel. So I will, of course, mention her excellent book with Richard Wynne-Jones, Englishness, the Political Force Transforming Britain. It's a great piece of social science, a wealth of data from the Future of England survey, and as well as the Four Nations State of the Union survey. Elsa co-directed these projects. So in this book, at one point, they had this metaphor of England and Englishness as the high wall keep at the center of concentric circles of belongings. And I tried to represent it here. England, as you can see with the flag, is the tallest tower, right? But what's interesting is what happens next. So Britain and the UK constitute the inner curtain wall. You see the flags of the other three nations.
Srdjan, your slides, you haven't moved on your slides.
Oh, sorry, what was that?
Yeah, now you can moved your slides on.
Can you make them full view?
And can you make it full view?
Oh, yes, of course. Full view. Is this better?
No.
Nothing's changed.
It's full screen. I only see the slides in full screen.
Okay, well,
Oh, well, anyway, it's a piece of artwork by myself. I mean, it's not that great. So yes, just imagine that there's an inner curtain wall, and in it the flags of the other three nations. You might see a mystery figure there. Let's call it Starmer or something like that. The outer wall is the most interesting part. It is the Anglosphere, meaning a transnational imagined community centered on five eyes member state. And so it is important for the purposes of what I want to talk about today. Henderson and Wynne-Jones in the book, elsewhere in the book, they suggest that the allure of the Anglosphere, this is a quote, is felt both at the popular as well as the elite levels, which is something I tend to agree with based on my own decidedly non-survey based research on Englishness and Britishness. So I studied this outer wall from an international perspective for a long time. Now, it turns out that the European radical right is interested in it too. This is to say it's not just English respondents in the aforementioned surveys who sometimes think about England as situated in this supposed community of common interest and values based on common history as well as common language. Turns out it's the radical right that also thinks of England in this way sometimes in geopolitical context. So why? Well, one reason is that the Anglosphere's unique position as being within and outside the West at once actually plays into the radical right discourses on geopolitics. So the stability, supposed stability of the Western identity and of course, of Euro-Atlantic, to mention but two geopolitical constructs, loom large in the imaginary of geopolitics or geopolitical imaginary according to the radical right. So that is, this, by the way, is from an Italian geopolitical magazine, not necessarily associated with the radical right. So what's my contention? Well, my contention is that the radical right contains different and often competing geopolitical visions. They construct different and often competing Anglospheres. This is important, I think, because we know a great deal about the positions of the radical right parties on a variety of topics: EU integration, EU enlargement, Russia, China, NATO, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, development aid, climate change. We don't know anything about AUKUS. We don't know anything about the Five Eyes, UK-US relations. and other geopolitically significant English-speaking goings-on. And so what I tried to do in this paper is tell a story of 3 discourses on or off by the radical right on the Anglosphere. So discourse number 1, I call it national conservatism, which is aligned now with the eponymous transnational NatCon movement. In London last year, you had a big meeting bringing together people like Suella Braverman, Nigel Vigar, Michael Gove, Yoram Hazony, etc. The person I mentioned last, Hazony, he's probably the most important as the chair of the Edmund Burke Foundation that organizes these NatCon conferences. The next one is in July in Washington. And so having gone through their various forms and modes of national conservative, the national conservative movement, if you like, you basically see that the main implication is that the Anglosphere is a thing, but it's very much part and parcel of a singular West. The Anglosphere states and societies, however, are drowning in the river of liberal nonsense, from neoliberalism to globalism to cosmopolitanism to le wokisme. These are all quotation marks. It's straight from the documents themselves. What's needed is a return to a more Christian democratic Europe, a rediscovery of the Anglo-American brand of conservatism. This is from Hazony's work. And only under these conditions is the West once again desirable, and with that, NATO and the EU. So I'll put the discussion of the political economy aside in the interest of time, but that in a nutshell is this first idea of the Anglosphere according to the radical right. I call it the national conservative Anglosphere. Okay, second discourse, I call it neo-Gaullism. Essentially a distinguishing feature of neo-Gaullism is the idea of standing up to the United States. It comes in very many forms. The radical right version is intimately connected not only to sovereignty and multipolarity, but also to civilizationism. So in this case, a multipolar world is defined by the incommensurability of civilizations and will be built around different civilizational states like China, Russia, Iran, India, and of course, Europe. Europe in this view is not a continent, but a civilization that is now gaining power thanks to the rise of patriots and also the relative decline of the liberal US-led West relative to China and the rest. Arguably, the leading proponent of this discourse or this perspective are the figures of the French Nouvelle Droite, specifically meaning this man here, Alain de Benoist, one of the founders of a think tank, well, not really a think tank, but it's called the Groupement de Recherche et d'Études pour la Civilisation Européenne, Grec, la croix bretonne. What you see here is one of its symbols, and it was founded in 1969. So they've been doing this for a very long time. De Benoist is credited for domesticating essentially Gramscian Marxist thought for radical right purposes, as well as for popularizing concepts such as metapolitics and ethno-pluralism. I won't get into the detail here, but for him, and this is a quote: a plural world grounded in the diversity of cultures is the optimal path of achieving differentialism or differentialist goals, another term that he coined. Which is and those goals are true decolonization of the world and also reverse migration of new non-Europeans from Europe. So the main stumbling block in this path are what he calls the maritime democracies, and that's his term for the Anglosphere. And I will just mention that for now. Again, a very interesting genealogy behind this position or this discourse. The next one. For the lack of a better word, I call it neo-Eurasianism. This term has gained attention and headlines in recent years, not least in the context of Russia's wars, the hybrid one against NATO and the war of conquest in Ukraine. And the case in point here, or figure in point, is Alexander Dugin, arguably the best known promoter of neo-Eurasianist ideas. Dugin writings are significant because they reveal not so much a strong and anti-Western sentiment as an anti-liberal one directed at what he calls the West's Atlanticist or Anglo-Saxon elements. And you hear this in the press service of the Kremlin a lot. If you have nothing better to do than listen to Dmitry Peskov and Zaharova, they talk about Anglo-Saxons and Atlanticist occupation of Europe, and that's Russia's sacred duty.
2 minutes left.
Sorry?
You have 2 minutes left, okay?
Yes, I'm done. Atlanticist occupiers. So that's Eurasianism. Obviously, there are limits to this type of analysis. Every discourse analysis has a lot of theoretical elements. One of them is deciding where one discourse ends and another begins. So another person associated with the Grek, Guillaume Fay, he's a second in command after Benoit, has a book chapter in 1998, which essentially appeals to a Europe from Toulouse to Vladivostok, another kind of version of neo-Eurasianism. So what I wanted to say is that between or among these three discourses, only one sees England as or rather the Anglosphere as an extension of England as part of the West. The other two position England and the Anglosphere as other, a blend of America's uninvited imperialism and a kind of Anglo-Saxon civilization state whose values and institutions have little or nothing in common with what Radical Right's vision of a post-liberal Europe. However, whereas New Gaullists configure the Anglosphere as a rival, Eurasianists view it as an enemy, and each discourse implies very different foreign policy orientations for Europe. I will let you imagine what those are, and we'll stop here. Just one more thing, if I can say. I started looking into the Chinese version of all of this, and the story gets very, very complicated very quickly. Thank you for your attention.
All right. So I think the chair said, you don't know what the titles are. Well, very imaginatively, I've taken out the world and put Australia in there. So this is called England in the World too. How does Australia view England? And I think I'll do as Helen and others have, just explain a little bit about where this research came from. I haven't done as Tim has done, and this isn't based on original research. It's more like adjacent research. In particular, some research I've been doing with Richard Hayden from Leeds on the place of the Anglosphere, or the idea of the Anglosphere in post-Brexit UK-Australia bilateral relations. But it also goes back to a long lost and much under-referenced chapter I wrote about 12 years ago called The English on Australia, which I want to draw on just to give you some of the architecture, if you like, this sort of socio-political architecture that there is for understanding England, Britain and the United Kingdom in Australia. And I'll draw on historical history for that. Tim might remember there was a chapter in the book that he and Almut Möller wrote about Brexit as seen from Australia, or the possibility of Brexit as seen from Australia. I'm also doing some historical research on Australia's purchase of a Magna Carta in 1952 with colleague at Monash, Kathleen Neal, and I've written something on monarchy, republicanism and the colonial fracture, borrowing a concept from French sociology to try and understand the way that the monarchy has been understood and is understood today. And I've got a PhD student called Tom Howe who's researching perceptions and receptions of global Britain in Australia. So I'm drawing on all these particular things, and without spoiling the main claim in response to Tim's provocation, is that the main idea is that there isn't really any understanding of England in Australia, particularly in terms of bilateral relations, outside of sport and particularly cricket. Right? So there is a way of understanding England, but it's cultural and historical more than political. and it's not contemporary. Right? So there are some nuances around that picture, which I will try and explain. So the first thing to say is that in relation to the English in Australia, England does not, or the English, I should say, does not fit very well into Australian multiculturalism. Now, multiculturalism, as you probably know, developed in the 1970s. It was borrowed from the Canadian model, which had developed out of biculturalism, so a way of trying to accommodate differences between Francophone and Anglophone Canadians, which in the 1960s had sort of reached a point where something needed to be done about it, and multiculturalism was the answer. So in that sense, multiculturalism never really theorized a place for a national majority at the centre. Now, this national majority was, of course, Australian by this stage in terms of the development of that national consciousness. And a lot of the institutional infrastructure around multiculturalism was around linguistic difference and accommodation of different languages. So, of course, the English and the British didn't fit very well into that. And so they didn't have things like broadcasting services in specific languages, such as there were for Italians, Greeks, Chinese, and so on. What they did have, though, was a particular status as pommies. Now, pommie is a term, you've probably heard this. I mean, you know, it's an Australian term. It's not clear whether it refers to English people or to British people. But it actually is a term that dates from just before the First World War. It's a play on the word pomegranate, an immigrant. I suppose you have the Australian accent back then, but the idea is that recent immigrants would go as red as pomegranates when they first arrived, and that's how you would tell them. So it's a contraction, an Australian contraction of pomegranate. It's usually seen as a kind of a status that denotes friendly rivalry, but sometimes it tips over into being perceived as denigratory. And there was a case in 2006 brought against a beer company, actually, that used the term pommie in its advertising to sell beer ahead of a cricket, the Ashes test in 2006. And the case was brought by a group called British People Against Racial Discrimination, who argued that the use of pommie in that particular context was derogatory. It didn't get up, but that's the case that they brought. There was in the late 90s, when I first arrived in Australia, a little bit of a transference of, if you like, that kind of new English sensibility that had become noticeable in the 1990s. You know, the survey data suggests that the early 90s are there, but the cultural moment is the Euro 96 football tournament, where the flag of St. George was suddenly everywhere. And there was something there in that a group had been set up called the English in Australia, or T, you know, so a little bit of a sense of humour there. But this was in a kind of a rival association to something called the UK Settlers Association, now the British Community of Australia, which was, and so T was specifically English, whereas UK Settlers Association was a kind of a friendly society, almost in the tradition of friendly societies that welcomed migrants from all across the UK and tried to settle them, help them settle into Australia, because for all the sort of idea of the English or the British being so-called invisible migrants, they did experience some difficulties settling in some cases, and particularly in the 1960s, there was a little bit of anti-British immigrant sentiment. And what you can see in the photo there is a miniature English village that is called Cockington Green, which is in Canberra, and it's based on a miniature English village in Torquay in Devon. And the owners, Australian owners, were so taken with this on a visit there in the 1970s that they set one up in Australia too. So, you know, the affinities are kind of really strong, but Englishness gets a bit lost for reasons that I'm going to delve into now. So I'm just checking that you did see that slide move just then.
Yes.
So here's the statue of Shakespeare in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. And here I'm taking a sort of a provocation from David Malouf, the Australian novelist, who in 2003 posed a question after he'd visited the Library of Congress and was so amazed by its collections there and was struck by the collections of Shakespeare here. And he was asking, well, to whom does Shakespeare belong? You know, England or English speakers or everyone? And related to that, and following on from what Srdjan has said, is, you know, what does the Anglo in Anglosphere denote? It's really more Anglophone than England. And again, England can get a little bit lost in this, in what I call in some of my other work, England's wider categories of belonging. Srdjan's developed that amazing cartoon of Richard and Ailsa's castle analogy. And but there's clearly something here where the boundaries, and this goes back to like Robin Cohen, you know, some years ago now, the boundaries of Englishness are fuzzy. And I think in the Anglosphere context, where the English language and the understanding of history is supposed to connect and cohere a discrete group of nations and states, to overly focus on England would seem sort of slightly too divisive, particularly when it's all about connecting states in confrontation with totalitarian powers. So I think that the history trumps the language in that particular regard. Then when we think about the English and global Britain, I originally didn't have that as plural. And then I just got to kind of thinking about, you know, how many global Britons there have been. And I think that this is really to do with, since the emergence of the Westphalian system, the United Kingdoms in their various iterations have been the vehicle for England's engagement with the world. So you know, I mean, you could go back to the 16th century and think, well, England did have some kind of emergent foreign policy. It certainly had bad relations with the papacy, pretty bad relations with Spain and so on. But after the Union of the Crowns, and particularly after the treaties of union, you start to get the United Kingdom as the vehicle for England's engagement. And during the 20th century, I think what's important there is that I think has been noted already in the panel. In the 19th century, people could make claims like England expects, or write books called The Expansion of England, and think about concepts like perfidious Albion, and just really equate England and Britain. But as Stuart Ward has shown, Stuart Ward has shown that the idea of Britain kind of replaces England in the 20th century. And this, in Australia's case, coincides with an era of both mass migration from the United Kingdom, predominantly England, to Australia, but at the same time as Australia's developed an own distinct nationality. Not fully distinct, as mine and Kathleen Neal's research on the Magna Carta shows, purchased in 1952, the year before the coronation of the Queen, but also in the middle of the Cold War, and was designed to really sort of say that Australia was part of this history of the rule of law, this history of that plugged it back into not only England, but also the United States, where the idea of the Magna Carta had been taken up by Americans as some sort of foundational document as well of theirs. And interestingly, that then talking about the hierarchies in amongst the Anglosphere is actually also designed to kind of show the United States that Australia could actually purchase this before they could, and spend a lot of money on this copy, which they then displayed in the Parliament and the National Library.
And we've got 2 minutes left.
Cool, thank you very much. So, but the point is that research has also shown that England and Britain gets very much merged. Magna Carta is an English event, but it gets, the references are always in the 1950s in Australia to Britain. Stuart Ward has shown how you can't, you know, around that time it was very difficult to use the adjective British. after Indian independence, and then when it came back into use after the UK had been used in the 1950s, and no one really liked it. It was too clumsy, didn't really have a collective noun, all this kind of thing, that it only denoted to people in Britain and not in the wider British world. So this then suggests that the projection coming back at the English in Britain and the United Kingdom from Australia in the official mind is one really that just reinforces Britishness. So I can say if I reread the research that I did with Richard, I could say that unprompted, none of the interviewees in Australia volunteered England as a category. It was always about the UK and Britain in the context of Brexit and what this meant for. And I think in reading Michael Kenny's book alongside, Stuart Ward's and in preparation of this, very much the official mind in Westminster and London is still focused on Britain, or I suppose you might sort of say it's focused on England, but it thinks of that as Britain. So then come back to sort of Arthur Orgier's thing that this ironic inversion has taken place. People used to say England and mean Britain, and now they say Britain and mean England. And still that gap of understanding is there. So I'm just going to conclude on the responding to Tim's questions. So the views on the UK's future in the research, particularly the semi-structured elite interviews that I did, fall along partisan lines. The Australian Labor Party sees the UK's future as uncertain and overstretched. The Liberals are more optimistic, so that's a kind of a centre-left, centre-right divide, which reflects historic views in Australia, I might add as well. Interviewees, as I mentioned, held next to no views about how England might shape UK foreign policy, or I don't think they even mentioned it. I would say partisan views tended to converge on issues of the UK and trade in the Indo-Pacific. They diverged on security, and the ALP tradition remembers Singapore as an act of great betrayal, and they don't lightly forget that. And the final point there is that England, as opposed to Britain or the UK, is most clearly visible in Australia in relation to sport, and that is slightly broadening out into, say, netball, rugby, soccer, as they would say here, but it's really about cricket. I'll just refer you back to the argument that took place in the long room over the Ashes last year to reinforce that point. But that's it from me. Thank you.
Okay, listen everyone, so we've got a few minutes left of the session, and Helen, I know you have to leave at 2:30, so should we maybe start by seeing whether there are any comments or questions perhaps directly for you, Helen? That would be somewhere to start.
There was one question online, but I don't think it's for Helena. Came up during Ben's talk.
Yeah.
Okay. It doesn't mean a lack of interest.
No.
We always need time to
4 papers ago.
think about it. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right.
When is the book out?
I'm only getting started, so
Yeah.
the idea is maybe I'll keep you posted.
Yes. Okay. Well, in that case, we can open it up more widely. I mean, is there anything that you would like to say, Helena? Sorry, I'm calling you Helena.
It's just totally fine. No, not really. I think my main takeaway from this session is also listening to the other papers is that the differences between the 4 component parts of the United Kingdom are crucially important for the future of the United Kingdom. I'm much less convinced that they play a big role. That's just my conclusion. Big role for British foreign policy, honestly. And because, we've seen all the detail how, yes, there are different attitudes, but then how much do people care about this? How do events play into this? I'm not saying, but it's hard for me to imagine another Brexit type event where this would play out in this way. And I also think that what really came across for me from all the papers from sort of us non-Brits is how yes, we've learned more about the differences, but especially when it comes to foreign policy, I mean, I don't think there's a single German foreign policy official or Brussels official who sits in his office in Brussels or Berlin and thinks about whether it's English or British foreign policy. I mean, I'm sorry to be blunt, but they just don't care, because they care about the end result that affects them. So I think, yeah, that would be my main conclusion. Possibly I'm being unfair, I think. And another question, which is just generally very interesting, and I think not just for Britain, we were talking about the differences between foreign and domestic policy and how the lines have become blurry. I think it's interesting to ask, when you see the attitudes in the different parts of the United Kingdom towards an issue such as NATO or the nuclear deterrent or something, and you see differences. For example, the Scots care less about the nuclear deterrent than the English, just to pick one of the examples. But then ultimately, who does foreign policy in this country, and how important? I mean, it's not like, I mean, foreign policy isn't so far exactly run by focus groups, right? So it's run by an elite in Westminster and Whitehall. And of course, it's also run by politicians who have to think about their electorate. But I mean, the connection between the two is very complex, actually. So the question is that even if there are certain differences, and others may take a different view, but even if there are certain differences in the worldview of, say, the average English voter and the average Scottish voter, just in practice, you sit in Foreign Office in Whitehall, and there is another major hacking attack against Estonia, and you have to rethink your whole NATO policy. Are you going to think about the differences between Scottish and English attitudes? I'm being provocative, but that's just something I keep wondering too.
Yeah, yes. So
I'm thinking back on the number of Scots who've been in the Foreign Office, and there are now many fewer Scots or Welsh, perhaps, prominent in the Parliamentary Labour Party who might expect to be in such roles. Am I wrong or right, compared to 20, 30 years ago? And that's an interesting development out of Brexit, and perhaps an interesting gloss on what you're saying.
Fair enough, yes.
Okay, fascinating. Shall I turn to the floor? Yes.
I just want to ask Helen, prompted a bit by Srdjan's excellent talk, that he referenced neo-Gaullist views of England being part of a perfidious Anglo-spheric civilization, increasingly, effete and denuded by wokeism and all the rest of it. There is there's an establishment view that's similar to that saw in particular during the financial crisis, a view that this was a sort of curse of the financialized liberal market economies. The UK and the US were the epicenters of the financial crisis. Sarkozy said that. He said this is the Anglo-Saxons. And I wonder, is there anything in German mainstream political discourse that associates us in that way?
It's an important and depressing question. I would point out that Sarkozy has by now really revealed his true colours and completely lost his way and mind, in my opinion. But coming to Germany, I mean, there is on the German far right, I think they're keeping this quiet, but deep down, the German far right as well as the German hard left, very hard left, so are ultimately fundamentally opposed to the principle of Westbindung. Westbindung means seeing Germany as part of the West, and that was a very important transformation after the Second World War. The priority of Konrad Adenauer to say that being part of Europe and NATO and the Euro-Atlantic, that is more important to us even than reunification. And that is one of many reasons why I personally, but what makes both the far right and the hard left so dangerous in Germany, in my personal opinion, is that they ultimately want to get us out of the West and out of NATO, out of the EU. And but this may not always come across very well, because at the same time, Brexit is an anti-European project. And at the time of the referendum, it played very much into the thinking of the far right in Germany, which was already far right, but much less, well, well, it was less radicalized than now, or maybe they hadn't just revealed their true colors. But the point is, they liked Brexit because it was destructive to the EU. And they would try to. So it is entirely possible that somebody of the German far right would come to London and try to flatter a Brexiteer. And at the same time, that person would privately have a very low opinion of the Anglo-Saxons. These two things, which seem contradictory, actually go hand in hand, which again makes it very dangerous in my opinion, because then people don't get that on the other side. So that's a concern I have. And there is this very sort of, I mean, there was sort of 100 years ago, this idea of the Kulturnation, sort of the you know, the stereotype, the shopkeepers versus the culture, yeah, and this this originally sort of intellectual idea led to down a very dark path. And the whole point of German foreign policy since the end of the Second World War has been to push against this, and has done this very successfully. What you've now seen in the European election, as worried as I am of some of the results, is that 65% of Germans are very much committed to Westbindung. But yes, this is worth bearing in mind, these kinds of cliches. I think so. And it's just, I mean, it's just this whole idea of sort of the Anglo-Saxon globalists is a far-right thinking, and you have it in many places around the world.
Thank you.
No, I'm really sorry.
Thank you very much. Yeah,
Sorry.
Thank you. Tim said we can run over 5 minutes. Anything else from the floor? I mean, you can carry on over coffee and tea. I don't think there's anything on the chat.
I just wanted to throw in a question for any of the panel, which is, when you're talking to people outside of England or outside of the UK, what do they imagine England to be like today? Because one of the phenomena of recent years has been very high levels of net immigration. And about 40% of all the people who live in the UK who weren't born here came in the last 10 years. So there's an astonishing change in the population to a much more diverse nation. I'm really quite interested in whether the England that people are talking about is the England that existed 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, or even England as it was at the time of Brexit, which is quite different to where it is now. So are we actually, in addition to the issues of politics and the nations and internal decision making, how up to date is people's imagination of the nature of the England and the UK that we're now dealing with?
Right. I can quickly start. I can think of one or two of the interviewees who talked about either romantic ideas of England or Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland and so forth, or very crude kind of stereotypical ideas. So I just go back to that, which they have those very simplified views, even having lived and worked in the UK, because as I pointed out, several of them were more than aware. I come from a privileged little bubble of an elite that have studied in the UK. So I've, in a way, been influenced by that view as well. The dreaming spires of Oxford, as opposed to living in somewhere run down. Don't mention my hometown, Crewe, but compared to Oxford versus somewhere like Crewe, for example. So they had a very privileged view. But in immigration, I have to go back through my transcripts.
Immigration, 20% of the population in the Republic was born elsewhere now. The population went up 5% last year, mostly from immigration. Ukrainians made a big difference, 100,000, doubling of the numbers of people coming in seeking asylum. Half of that doubling to do with refugees actually from Britain's Rwanda policy rather than from wherever else they came from. But the point is, Ireland is also changing in this remarkable way and coming to terms with the stuff. So again, we probably know because we're next door neighbours that's shifting, but these things happen fast.
There are two remote speakers. There's some translating tea and coffee out there, but would you like to just make a brief intervention before we break for the next session?
Well, I'll make one, but maybe Srdjan, do you want to do one as well? Do you want to go first?
Sure, go ahead. I'll follow.
Okay, all right. So I would just say that there's a long tradition of intellectual searching for the real England. And this is, Cobden on his rural rides and Orwell and Priestley, and there are all sorts of people. And it's really a question of like, what England are we kind of looking for? Because I think, Crewe and Oxford are both England. And I would go even further to say, I know she's left the room now, but I think maybe Helene was driving too much of a I know what she was saying is that foreign policy is made by elites in Whitehall and Westminster and so on. But at the same time, Britain is England, and there already is an English foreign policy in as much as that. It's made with English interests, yes, of course, there are nuclear bases in Scotland, and you wouldn't want the Russians to sort of get a foothold in Northern Ireland and so on and so forth. But, I think that, England and Britain are just merged. And if we didn't look to kind of Scottish or Irish models of independence, then we might sort of start to see England in a slightly different way as something where Britain and England are really just so imbricated with each other, it's hard to pull them apart. So that's really just a sort of a defence of the concept, I think, which is really good behind the conference, which is you just stick England conceptually where Britain normally is and see what happens. Anyway, enough from the Southern Hemisphere.
Srdjan?
Just very quickly, the census, the 2021 census shows just how multicultural England and the UK are in comparison to the rest of Europe, which, according to the radical right, is exactly the problem. If their goal is to build a revitalized Europe of nations with Christian heritage and sovereign ethno-states, then this is precisely the wrong kind of model. The model polluted by feminism, genderism, multiculturalism, anti-racism, and all those of things. So this is the kind of England that scares them and motivates them to unite and overcome otherwise very, very deep differences.
Okay, thank you. So I propose then that we break for sort of 10 minutes or so on. I won't be able to rejoin, unfortunately. I've got to mock Viva, a PhD student. I'd rather stay, quite honestly. But let's join again in thanking the speakers who hopefully will stay online, even in Australia, I'm not sure.
Sorry, no, too late.
No, I don't blame you. And thanks again to the speakers on the panel. Thank you very much.